Hey guys, okay, we're going to talk about the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system today, and I'll get through as many of the notes as I can. All right, so just to kind of start with, we've got some different functions of the circulatory system. The first function is for transportation, and that's really the main one. We kind of think of it like the highway system of the body. So transportation system is definitely going to be one of the biggest, most important functions. Two of the things that it carries that you think of right away are oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it also carries many other things. So let me write a couple of those things down. So the first thing is it carries oxygen, O2, all kinds of nutrients. And usually at this point I stop and I ask you guys to volunteer some of the nutrients that you think are some of the things that the circulatory system might carry. Students usually come up with some different ideas. Glucose or sugar is a main one. Amino acids, proteins, fatty acids, and different substances that we would digest, break down into small pieces, and then we need to get those to all the different parts of the body. So it's going to carry oxygens, nutrients, like glucose is one of the main ones, sugar, and hormones to the cells. So think about your brain cells, think about your muscle cells, think about your tissue cells. They're going to need all kinds of things. And so the circulatory system is how they get those things. Another thing that the circulatory system does is it carries some of the bad things. And some of those bad things would be carbon dioxide and then other wastes. So those things, though, we want to carry away from the cells. And we're going to be bringing those to the kidneys or to the lungs so that we can breathe them out or pass those through. Okay. Second function of the circulatory system is to regulate body temperature. And so if you think about when you might walk or run, or you're in gym class, or you're in whatever sport you're in, and you're working out, your skin, especially your face, will oftentimes get flushed, okay? And what we mean by flushed is we mean that you get all red, okay? And the reason for that is because your body's trying to cool itself off. You're warmed up because you're moving around and your muscles are working, and now the body wants to cool off. So the blood vessels that are right underneath your skin, they will dilate. Dilate means they open wider. So those blood vessels go from being narrow to being wider. And then all that blood is flowing through there, really close to the skin. And you're going to have the warmth of that blood dissipating out into the air, and then therefore you're going to be cooling off, okay? So regulating body temperature is going to be the next one. If you are too cold, then your body is going to go back and constrict those blood vessels and go back to being narrow, okay? And then you're going to then look whiter because the blood vessels are going to be smaller. There's less blood near the surface of your skin, and you're going to then hold that heat from that blood inside your body. Okay. The third and the last one is an immune system function. And so it's going to be protection from different things. One of the main things is going to be disease. The part of the blood that helps protect from disease is going to be the white blood cells. Okay. It'll help protect from injury, and that would be things like the platelets. And the platelets are part of your blood that help to clot the blood so that you don't bleed too much. Okay. And then besides disease, foreign substances. So things that we don't want to get into the body. Okay. So those are the three main functions of the cardiovascular or the circulatory system, okay? I mentioned a few kinds of blood cells already, so blood is going to be the next thing that we're going to talk about. Blood has many different parts. The non-living part, the part that's not alive, is the plasma. So this is going to be non-living, not actual cells. It's going to be the part of the blood that is mostly water, okay? So I think they say 90% of your plasma is water. Okay, so mostly water. if you look at the picture over here, plasma makes up a little bit more than half of your blood volume. So if you look right here, plasma, I think they say it's about 55% of your blood is plasma. The other 45% you see at the bottom are the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, okay? 55% of your blood is plasma. And remember, of that 55%, most of that plasma is water. 90% is water. Functions of the plasma. This is where we're going to be carrying all those things. So to transport nutrients, gases like the oxygen and the CO2. The nutrients we talked about, remember, think to yourself real quick if you can remember some of those nutrients. Okay, that might be something like glucose or sugar or amino acids. Those are going to be dissolved in the plasma, so they're floating around in the plasma. Okay. Another thing it does is it regulates the amount of fluids. So it regulates our fluid levels. And something else, this is a word you might hear in commercials and things like that for Gatorade, electrolytes. It regulates our electrolyte levels. Keeps everything in balance. Remember, that's homeostasis, okay? And then the last part of homeostasis that the blood helps is it maintains the correct pH. pH measures acids and bases. So our blood is generally slightly basic on a pH scale of 0 to 14. 7 is exactly neutral. Above 7 is basic. Blood, I think, is usually like a 7.5. So a little bit basic, and we want it to stay that way. If it gets too acidic or too basic, then it's going to probably cause organ failure and then death very quickly. It doesn't have a very wide range of what it can do. All right, more about blood cells. So besides plasma, the other 45% of the blood are the blood cells. And so there's a couple words that we're going to learn. The first word is hematocrit. Sometimes you'll hear this word on Grey's Anatomy or Chicago Med. Hematocrit is the percentage of our blood cells that are in a sample. Let me erase that real quick. Okay, percentage of blood cells in a sample that they might take. And there's a certain number that's going to be healthy, and if you're above that or below that, then they might get a little bit worried. What blood cells are they looking at? Well, the first two types of blood cells that we're going to talk about are going to be red blood cells and white blood cells. Okay, we'll talk about platelets on the next slide. So red blood cells, they oftentimes abbreviate so that you don't have to write it all out. And so whenever you see RBC, or if you hear me say RBC, that's going to refer to red blood cells. A couple things that you want to know about red blood cells. So first of all, in this picture, red blood cells are going to be right here. Okay, they have kind of a funny shape. Red blood cells have a biconcave shape. Concave means that it kind of dips in, okay, in the middle. So not quite like a donut because there's not a hole all the way through, but it was as if you took your fingers and you squished it in the middle. And so it sinks in right in the middle on both sides, okay? The biconcave shape is super important because it adds more surface area. So SA stands for surface area. Why do we want to have lots of surface area? Remember the digestive system? We wanted lots of surface area for gas exchange, for diffusion. In the digestive system, we wanted lots of surface area for diffusion of nutrients across. We wanted to absorb all those nutrients, so there were villi and microvilli. In our lungs, in our respiratory system, we wanted lots of surface area for diffusion of oxygen and CO2. Well, red blood cells' job is to carry oxygen. And so they want to have lots of surface area for being able to carry lots of oxygen. So we say for gas transport, but let's write down what we mean by that is to carry lots of oxygen. Okay. Another thing that's kind of interesting about red blood cells is when they mature, so as they kind of age, they have no nucleus. And so they have a nucleus when they're first made, so through mitosis, and then that nucleus kind of dissolves away. And the important thing about that is exactly the same as the biconcave thing, is it gives more area, more room, okay? for carrying oxygen. And the specific thing that carries the oxygen is something called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein, and every hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens. We have millions and millions and millions and millions of hemoglobins on every red blood cell. It's crazy. So the fact that they can add space for hemoglobins is really important. So actually what happens is when the red blood cell loses its nucleus, it gives room for 250 more hemoglobins, which is crazy. All right, white blood cells are next, and they're also going to be a blood cell that is alive, just like the red blood cells. Remember, the plasma was not alive. So white blood cells, or WBCs for short. Okay, they have a couple of functions, but you're going to hear most of them sounding very similar. They protect against disease. So they're going to protect against infection. Okay. They do something called phagocytosis, where they basically eat or basically like chomp up any bad guys. So I'm just going to say eat in quotes. Okay. Bacteria. They make antibodies, which help with our immune system as well. Another thing they can do is they can actually move in and out. The way that they describe it is they describe amoeboid movement. I will post a video of a white blood cell moving around like an amoeba, which is a protist that can kind of move around using its own cytoplasm. So it has this amoeboid movement, but what's important about that is it can move in and out of our capillaries. Most of our blood stays in our capillaries, right? Think about it. We don't want the blood to leave the capillaries. That would be bad because then we would be bleeding. Let me see if I can get that to be, there we go, capillaries. Okay, we don't want the blood to leave the blood vessels. We want them to stay in the blood vessels. But white blood cells, since they're going and eating the bacteria, they're eating the bad guys, we want them to be able to move in and out of the capillaries so that they can go to wherever the infection is. All right. Next up is hemostasis, which is the platelet part. So hemostasis, or the stoppage of bleeding. Okay, hemo always refers to blood. If you ever hear heme, it refers to blood and the hemoglobin part. So the first thing that we're going to do is just talk about the 4 main steps in stopping bleeding. If you had a blood vessel rupture or break, or you had a cut or a wound, okay, the first thing that happens is there's muscle spasms around the area. Oftentimes they'll call that vasospasms because the blood vessels also will constrict. They have muscle in them as well. There's a layer of muscle in our blood cells. And the function of this is to lessen the blood loss. If you think about it, if the muscles spasm or they constrict, it's going to make less room for the blood to travel through, and you'll have less blood traveling through and therefore less bleeding. Okay. Next up is going to be platelets coming along, and they're the last type of blood cell. They're actually fragments of blood cells that have broken apart. Okay, so the platelets are going to stick to the lining of your blood vessels. And the job of the platelets is to stop the blood from being too thin. So it thickens the blood and it causes what they call a clot. And then you get all these blood cells kind of sticking together. And it basically acts like a plug. So they say it forms a platelet plug, and that sort of seals the wound. Okay. The third thing that happens is we get coagulation. That's a fancy word that you'll hear when they talk about blood clotting. Okay, so the coagulation will form a clot using all kinds of things. They're called clotting factors. They're proteins besides the platelets. And in this picture, you can kind of see all kinds of these threads and little dots and things like that. You see red blood cells stuck in there. Those are the big guys with that biconcave shape. But we're going to get these clotting factors, these proteins that also help to thicken the blood. And then those threads, which are, again, more proteins, these fibrin threads, are going to stick to the wound. It almost acts like gauze, like you're putting a big Band-Aid on it. And so the fibrin threads are going to stick to the damaged blood vessels to kind of clot the area and to kind of seal it off. And when they stick, they trap any blood cells, any other platelets. Just going to kind of go back and forth here around the picture. And this finishes the clot forming. If I remember correctly, there's a question on your multiple choice part of your test that just asks for you to put these steps in order, okay? So that's going to be the main idea of that slide. All right, we talked about blood, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the heart itself. So the heart is the pump, and that's the pump that pumps all that blood that we were just talking about all around the blood vessels. So the layers of the heart wall, okay, are going to be starting with kind of like the, I guess I should say the outside in. So we've got all kinds of different areas. So the first one we'll do is the pericardium. Oops, spelled that wrong. Let me try again. We did layers of the muscle. We've done all kinds of different layers, so these should kind of sound familiar. This pericardium is sort of like a membrane. Think of it like a sac. It basically encloses the whole heart. See if I can get you to be able to read that. Encloses heart. There we go. It's a little better. There's fluid just inside of it. It decreases the friction. Okay. The next layer is going to be the epicardium. The epicardium is going to be the layer, basically it's kind of connected to the pericardium. So it's going to be the next layer outside of there. So if we look at this picture, we've got pericardium, and that's going to be out here. See if I can get that. Okay. And then we have the, do orange next, epicardium, and that's going to be just inside, right there. So epicardium is just inside of there. I don't really have much more to say about that. Endocardium, I'll do another color. Let's do that yellow. The endocardium is going to be on the inside here. And so see it all in here. It's this thin layer. You can see them layering back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Okay, that's going to be our endocardium. And then myocardium is going to be the actual muscle. Remember, myo means muscle. Okay, and so, myocardium is going to be basically heart muscle. Okay, so let me finish off writing a couple more. Here we go. Endocardium is on the very inside. Okay. So lines the inner chamber is what we'll say. Think about the chambers that you labeled the other day being things like the left atrium, the right atrium, and the ventricles. Okay, lastly is the myocardium. Myo means muscle. So remember, myocardium just means the heart muscle itself. So fancy word for heart is cardiac. All right, so we've got cardiac muscle layer. That basically is the majority of the heart. Okay. All right, so a little bit about the different ventricles and atria of the heart, the different chambers of the heart. We got the right atria here. The right atria is going to be, atria are always on the top, and so we got the right atrium right here. It's going to be this area. Okay. Actually, when you dissect a heart, it's actually not very big. The ventricles are much larger. This picture is not really to scale. I would say on a typical heart, if you were to draw it, something like this. Okay. The atria at the top would maybe be like that, and then the ventricles The bottom are like 3/4 of the size of the heart, and then 1/4 is probably the atria. So that's probably a little bit more accurate. But the right atria looks like it's on the left-hand side, but remember, everything's a mirror image because we're looking at it in a picture. So the right atria is here. They're showing it blue because it carries deoxygenated blood. Deoxygenated blood is not really blue, but it's a darker red. And so they use blue just to kind of show that. So the blood would be coming in from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. It just traveled around the body, and now it's going to go into the right atria. So it's going to get blood from 3 sources. So it receives blood. Where does it receive blood from? Well, it receives it from the superior vena cava. It receives it from the inferior vena cava. And it actually receives it from the coronary sinus. I think they mentioned this in the video you watched. Let me write that a little bit better so you know how to spell that. The coronary sinus is right around here. Okay. Here we go. And it's actually receiving blood from the heart itself. All right, there is one other part that you see here, which was right behind where I just colored in, but it's going to be right, so I'm going to use another color here, and that's the fossa ovalis. It's actually a remnant, which means it's left over from when you were a baby, when you were a fetus, and so it's sort of like scar tissue, I guess I would say. All right, left atrium is next. Left atrium is going to be carrying oxygenated blood, and so generally they show it being reddish in color. So we got the left atrium over here. It's receiving blood from a couple sources, so let me write that down. Receives blood from, oh, by the way, it's oxygenated blood, so we got that, from the lungs. So the left lung and the right lung. You also see a bicuspid valve there. The bicuspid valve has another name, which is called the mitral valve. And the mitral valve, or bicuspid valve, is under a lot of pressure because the left side of the heart is under more pressure. The left side of the heart is much bigger. It's much thicker. You can tell that in the size of the myocardium here. This is much thicker. Okay. And then you have this really thick part at the bottom here, and that's contributing to the left side of the heart, and then much thicker over here. This area over on the left side is going to be much thinner, but on the right side is much thinner. Everything's opposite mirror image. So the left side, which is going to be this area, has a much thicker wall of muscle, and that's because it's pumping blood out to the whole body. But the mitral valve, the bicuspid valve, oftentimes you'll have something called a mitral valve prolapse. You might hear about that in somebody who is older. The valve actually basically stops working very well. It bulges backwards, and it basically leaks blood then. It doesn't kind of shut properly, and so it leaks backwards into the left atrium, and blood leaks through. So it makes it not as efficient. It makes it not as strong as it needs to. We want the blood all to be flowing in one direction, which is out of the atria into the ventricle. And so if this doesn't close properly over here, the blood doesn't just go in the one direction it's supposed to. It'll leak backwards a little bit, which is going to make the heart less efficient. Okay. The ventricles, as I mentioned at the bottom, are much larger than the atria. So the ventricles are going to be the bottom 2 chambers of the heart. We've got the right and you've got the left ventricles. Starting with the right, I'm going to do it in blue because it would have deoxygenated blood. So the right ventricle has deoxygenated blood. I'm just going to abbreviate that. And it sends it to the lungs. And think about what the lungs do. The lungs are going to oxygenate it. So it's sending the blood out, blue, not really blue, but we're going to use it. And then it's going to be going to the lungs. Okay, it goes to the lungs. It picks up the oxygen, and then it's going to come in, remember, through the left atrium down into the left ventricle, which is here, and then it's going to send the blood out. Okay, so the left side, we'll use red. It has oxygenated blood, and it's going to send it to the body to be delivering all that oxygen so that all of our cells can get the oxygen. The last part that I wanted to mention on this slide is all of these little strands that you see here and here and here. We kind of think of them like puppet strings. Those are called chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae. You can see it right here if you can't read my writing. The chordae tendineae are basically like kind of like strings, and they're opening and closing the valves, and they're attached to the muscles so that as the muscle contracts and relaxes, these get pulled or pushed to open and close the valves. Okay. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about today for this first set of notes is the thickness of the cardiac walls. I mentioned this. It's hard to tell in that particular picture. I tried to show it a little bit better, but this picture shows it really well. So remember, right side of the heart, okay, is going to be over here, and it's going to be deoxygenated blood. Okay, so that's going to be this side. Here is the right ventricle. Okay, if you took a cross section through it and just look at the size or kind of the diameter of this wall of muscle, not very thick comparison to the right side. Everything's mirror image. Comparison to the left side. This side of the heart, okay, as I'm coloring in all the myocardium and then up through the septum here in the middle, okay, is much thicker. The diameter across is much larger, and that's the left-hand side. Remember, the left-hand side has oxygenated blood, okay, and the right-hand side has deoxygenated blood. But the reason for the thickness and wall difference is that on this left-hand side, it's sending blood to the lungs. Think about the distance between your heart and your lungs, right? Your heart's in the middle of your body, and there's a lung on each side. So it only has to go a few inches left or right, and that blood has already gotten to its final location, which is the lungs, and then it comes right back. That's a really easy trip. But the right-hand side of the heart has oxygen. The left-hand side of the heart, I'll get it right eventually, the left-hand side of the heart has oxygenated blood, and its job is to send that blood out to the body. Well, it could be sending it to your brain, which is about 1 foot away, maybe 1.5 feet, or down to your feet, which is like 3 or 4 feet away. So it's going to need to be much stronger. The walls are going to be much thicker. It's going to have much more muscle in order to pump that blood all the way around the body. So I'm just going to say to pump the blood farther, right? All the way to our head, all the way to our fingertips, all the way to our toes. And so that wall of muscle is much larger. It's under way more pressure on the left side. The walls are thicker on the left side. And that's why when people put their hand over their heart for like the Pledge of Allegiance, they oftentimes put their hand on the left-hand side of their chest. The heart actually isn't on the left side. It's right in the middle. When they do open heart surgery, they cut you right down the middle of your sternum, right in the middle of your chest. But it feels stronger on the left-hand side. You feel your heartbeat more on the left-hand side because that left-hand side is going to be thicker. So in this picture here, I would say that the heart is like 2/3 left ventricle and left atria, and then the other third, much smaller, is going to be the right ventricle and the right atria. So it just feels like a much stronger heartbeat on that left-hand side because the wall of muscle is so much thicker, and that beat is going to be stronger on that side. Okay, I'm going to stop there for today, and we'll do another set of notes tomorrow on the next probably 10 or 12 slides.